The emergency services coordinator slammed the report down on the metal table so hard it echoed through the disaster relief tent. "You're telling me you built an unauthorized flood barrier that diverted water into residential areas, Commissioner?" Janet Walsh's voice cut through the chaos of radios crackling and volunteers shouting coordinates outside. Daniel Chen stood ankle-deep in muddy water that had seeped through the tent floor, his engineering jacket torn and stained from 3 days of non-stop rescue operations. Behind him, the sounds of helicopters ferrying families from rooftops mixed with the distant wail of sirens. "I didn't divert anything. I tried to prevent this exact scenario. Prevent it." Walsh's laugh was bitter. "Riverside Heights is underwater because your little project failed catastrophically. 12 families displaced, millions in damage, and you want to play victim?" Daniel's jaw tightened. The irony wasn't lost on him that the same woman who'd blocked his flood mitigation proposal 18 months ago was now blaming him for the disaster. What she didn't know yet was that he'd recorded every single meeting, every rejection, every dismissive comment about his unnecessary engineering assessments, district from complete destruction. The residential flooding happened because the city's 50-year-old drainage system, through photos of waterlogged homes, the mayor's breathing down my neck. The media is calling it the worst flood in county history. Someone needs to answer for this. She looked up at Daniel with cold calculation. "And you're the one who took it upon yourself to play God with our water management." "I have documentation," Daniel said quietly. "Every warning I gave, every meeting where I explained what would happen if we didn't upgrade the storm drains. Documentation won't bring back Mrs. Patterson's house or fix the Riverside Elementary School basement." Walsh leaned forward. "An independent contractor, Chen, you don't have authority to build flood barriers in city limits." Daniel felt the familiar sting of being dismissed as an outsider. He'd been the lead engineer on 3 major flood prevention projects in neighboring counties. But here he was, just another Asian contractor who'd overstepped his bounds. "I used my own property. The barrier was built entirely on my land. Your land that happens to border the watershed." Walsh's tone grew sharper. "Your barrier that forced water into neighborhoods that hadn't flooded in decades. Flood wall devastates community." What they wouldn't report was that his barrier had prevented the chemical plant from flooding, or that the city had ignored his warnings about the deteriorating infrastructure for over a year. Flicker across her face, not just anger, but fear. "You're suspended from any city contractor work pending investigation." "Investigation by whom?" Daniel pressed. "The same department that ignored my decisions. Watch your tone, Chen." Walsh stood up, water splashing around her boots. "I've got 40 years in emergency management. I don't need some hotshot engineer telling me how to do my job." Daniel pulled out his own phone, scrolling to a video file dated 6 months ago. "Then maybe you can explain this." He turned the screen toward Walsh. The video showed her in a city council meeting, dismissing his flood risk assessment as overly cautious and economically unfeasible. Her exact words, "Mr. Chen seems to think we need to rebuild half the city every time there's a weather forecast." Walsh's face went pale. "That was taken out of context, was it?" Daniel's voice remained steady, but his eyes blazed. "Because I also have the email where you told the mayor that approving my mitigation plan would be political suicide right before the election." The tent fell silent, except for the drumming of rain on the canvas above. Walsh realized she was dealing with someone who'd been systematically building a case, not just throwing together a desperate defense. Daniel wasn't just an engineer. He was someone who'd anticipated this exact confrontation. "The real question," Daniel continued, "is whether you're going to keep fighting the evidence, or whether you're going to help me save the rest of the neighborhood before this storm gets worse." Walsh stared at him, understanding dawning that the man she'd dismissed as a troublemaker might be the only person who could prevent this disaster from becoming a complete catastrophe. But her political survival depended on making someone else the villain, and Daniel Chen was the perfect scapegoat until now. Thunder rolled overhead. The real flood was just beginning. The rain hadn't stopped in 4 days, and Daniel's makeshift command center in his garage looked like a war room. Maps covered every surface, marked with red X's where the drainage systems had failed, and blue lines showing water flow patterns. His laptop displayed real-time data from the weather sensors he'd installed throughout the watershed. The same sensors the city had refused to purchase when he'd proposed them. His phone buzzed with another emergency call. Elderly woman, whose house had taken the worst hit, was trapped on her second floor. Daniel grabbed his kayak from the garage wall and launched it into what used to be Riverside Avenue. 20 minutes later, he was helping Mrs. Patterson through her bedroom window into the kayak. She was clutching a photo album and shivering despite the warm rain. "I don't understand," she kept saying. "This street never floods, never in 40 years. Daniel paddled carefully toward higher ground, avoiding the submerged stop signs and mailboxes. "Mrs. Patterson, I need you to listen to me. It's because the storm drains collapsed." "But that woman on the news," she said. "I know what she said. When was the last time the city cleaned those storm drains?" Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a moment, thinking, I called them every spring about the drain at the corner. It was always clogged with leaves and debris. They kept saying they'd get to it." Daniel felt a surge of validation, but it was overshadowed by guilt. These people were suffering while he played detective. "How long since they cleaned it?" "Years," she whispered. "Maybe 5 years." As they reached the evacuation center, Daniel saw Walsh directing rescue operations from a dry command trailer. She was surrounded by city officials and media, all of them looking for someone to blame. When she spotted Daniel helping Mrs. Patterson out of the kayak, her expression hardened. "Chen," she called out, "you're supposed to be staying away from the disaster area." "I'm rescuing people," Daniel called back. "You can arrest me later." Mrs. Patterson looked between them, confusion evident on her face. "This young man saved my life." "Why are you talking to him like that?" Walsh approached, her boots squelching in the mud. "Ma'am, this is the person whose barrier caused the flooding in your neighborhood." "No," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "The flooding happened because the drain at the corner of my street has been clogged for years. I called the city about it dozens of times." Daniel saw Walsh's face change. This wasn't the narrative she'd been selling to the media. "And Mrs. Patterson, you're in shock. You need medical attention." "I'm not in shock," the elderly woman snapped. "I'm angry. I'm angry that the city ignored my calls for help, and I'm angry that you're trying to blame this man for your failures." Daniel helped Mrs. Patterson toward the medical tent, but her words echoed across the evacuation center. Other residents began to gather, and Daniel realized this was the moment everything would change. The truth was finally finding its voice. By dawn, and social media was buzzing with residents sharing their own experiences with the city's negligent maintenance. Daniel's phone hadn't stopped ringing reporters, engineers from neighboring counties, even a state official who'd been monitoring the situation. He stood in the ruins of what used to be Riverside Park, surveying the damage with his waterproof tablet. The data was conclusive. His barrier had worked exactly as designed, diverting water away from the chemical plant and the main business district. The residential flooding had been caused by the catastrophic failure of aging infrastructure. The city had refused to upgrade. Walsh approached him, looking haggard after a sleepless night. "We need to talk about what your resignation." Daniel didn't look up from his tablet. "About fixing this." Walsh's voice was strained. "The state's sending investigators, the insurance companies are asking questions, and the media." She gestured helplessly at the news vans lining the street. "Good," Daniel said simply. "Maybe now something will actually get done." Walsh sat down heavily on a waterlogged bench. "I know you think I'm some kind of monster, but I was trying to protect the city's budget. Do you know what your flood prevention plan would have cost? Less than this?" Daniel swept his arm across the devastated landscape. "Millions less." "We didn't have millions in the budget. You found 30 million for the new city hall renovation." Daniel finally looked at her. "You found 15 million for the downtown parking garage, but you couldn't find 3 million to prevent this." Walsh was quiet for a long moment. The mayor said flood prevention was a hard sell to voters. "Infrastructure's not sexy. Neither is this." Daniel gestured at the destruction around them. "But here we are." A helicopter circled overhead, carrying another family to safety. Daniel watched it disappear beyond the tree line, then turned back to Walsh. "I'm going to testify to the state investigators. I'm going to show them every document, every email, every recording of our meetings. That'll destroy careers." "Good." Daniel's voice was hard. "Maybe the next emergency management coordinator will actually manage emergencies instead of playing politics." Walsh stood up, water dripping from her jacket. "You know this won't bring back their homes." "No," Daniel agreed, "but it might prevent the next flood from being this bad." As Walsh walked away, Daniel received a text from his contact at the State Environmental Agency. "Preliminary investigation shows systemic infrastructure failure. Your barrier prevented chemical contamination event. Full report in 72 hours. Daniel looked out over the flooded neighborhood, knowing that vindication was coming. But it felt hollow against the backdrop of so much preventable suffering. The state investigators arrived, like a small army environmental engineers, infrastructure specialists, and forensic accountants who immediately began dissecting 20 years of city maintenance records. Daniel met them at his barrier, which stood intact and functional despite the media's claims of catastrophic failure. Lead investigator Sarah Kim ran her hand along the concrete structure, checking the engineering specifications against Daniel's original plans. "This is solid work," she said. "How long did it take you to build?" 6 months, Daniel replied, "working weekends and evenings." "And the city opposed this." Daniel pulled out his tablet, showing her the trail of emails and meeting transcripts. "They said it was unnecessary. Commissioner Walsh specifically stated that my flood risk assessment was alarmist. Kim's team was already taking water samples from both sides of the barrier, measuring flow rates and documenting the differential flooding patterns. The evidence was overwhelming." Daniel's barrier had performed exactly as designed, protecting the industrial area, while the residential flooding had been caused by infrastructure. Failures in completely different parts of the drainage system. Mr. Chen, Kim said, "I need to ask you something directly. Did you have any ulterior motive for building this barrier? Any business interests that would benefit from flooding in residential areas?" Daniel laughed bitterly. "You mean besides the fact that I live in this community? My own house is 3 blocks from here. I built this barrier to protect everyone, including myself." Kim nodded, making notes. "The preliminary data supports your story, but I need to understand the timeline. When exactly did you first propose municipal flood mitigation?" Daniel walked her through 18 months of bureaucratic stonewalling, showing her the detailed proposals he'd submitted, the environmental impact studies he'd funded himself, and the increasingly desperate warnings he'd sent as the infrastructure deteriorated. Each document was timestamped and cross-referenced with weather data and maintenance records. "This is extremely thorough," Kim said, reviewing the files. "Almost like you expected to need this evidence." "I've been doing this for 15 years, Daniel replied. "I know how these things go. When something goes wrong, they always blame the contractor." Kim's phone buzzed with a text from her team leader. "Storm drain analysis complete. Infrastructure failure at 17 different points. City maintenance records show no significant work in past 8 years." She looked up at Daniel with a mixture of respect and sympathy. "Mr. Chen, I think you're going to be vindicated, but I also think you're going to discover that this problem goes much deeper than Commissioner Walsh." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Walsh appeared at the edge of the investigation site, flanked by city lawyers and looking like she hadn't slept in days. The confrontation Daniel had been anticipating was finally about to begin. Walsh approached the investigation site with the determined stride of someone who'd spent the night preparing for battle. Her lawyers flanked her like bodyguards, briefcases in hand in expensive suits, somehow still crisp despite the disaster zone around them. Commissioner Walsh, Sarah Kim, greeted her professionally. "We need to discuss the city's maintenance records." "I'm here to cooperate fully," Walsh replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "But I want to make sure Mr. Chen's role in this disaster is properly documented." Daniel stepped forward, his tablet in hand. "Then let's start with this." He turned the screen toward the group, showing a video of Walsh at a city council meeting 6 months earlier. Her voice was clear, Mr. Chen's flood mitigation proposal is an expensive solution to a problem that may never materialize. Walsh's face flushed. That was taken out of context. Was it? Daniel swiped to the next video. Because here's you, 3 months later, telling the mayor that approving my plan would be political suicide during an election year. One of Walsh's lawyers stepped forward. My client was representing the financial interests of the city. Your client was gambling with people's lives, Daniel interrupted, and she lost. Kim held up a hand. Let's focus on the facts. Commissioner Walsh, our analysis shows that Mr. Chen's barrier functioned exactly as designed. The residential flooding was caused by infrastructure failures in the storm drainage system. When was the last comprehensive maintenance performed on those systems? Walsh glanced at her lawyers, then back at Kim. We maintain those systems on a regular schedule. Define regular, Kim pressed. Annual inspections, repairs as needed. Daniel laughed harshly. Annual inspections. Mrs. Patterson called the city about a clogged drain for 5 years. 5 years of complaints, and nothing was done. We can't respond to every minor complaint. Daniel's voice rose. That minor complaint was about a drainage system that just failed catastrophically and flooded half the neighborhood. Kim's assistant approached with a tablet full of data. Commissioner, our records show that the city allocated $2.3 million for storm drain maintenance over the past 5 years, but expenditure records show only $400,000 was actually spent. Where did the rest of the money go? The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Walsh's lawyers exchanged glances, and Daniel realized this was about more than just bureaucratic incompetence. This was about corruption. The funds were reallocated to other pressing infrastructure needs, Walsh said carefully. Such as Kim's tone was sharp. The downtown revitalization project, the new city hall, public safety facilities. Daniel pulled up another document on his tablet. You spent $800,000 on decorative lighting for the downtown area. $800,000 that could have upgraded the storm drains and prevented this disaster. That's not a fair comparison, isn't it? Daniel's voice was deadly quiet. You chose aesthetic improvements over public safety. You chose political optics over engineering reality. And now, people are homeless because of your choices. Walsh's composure finally cracked. I've been protecting this city for 40 years. I've seen a dozen contractors like you come and go, all promising the sky and delivering nothing but overpriced repairs. Then where are they now? Daniel challenged. Where are all these contractors who failed you? Because I'm the only one who actually built something to protect this community. Kim stepped between them. This is exactly why we need a full investigation. Mr. Chen, your barrier clearly worked as designed. Commissioner Walsh, the city's infrastructure clearly failed. The question is whether this was negligence or something more systematic. As the investigators continued their work, Daniel realized that his vindication was just the beginning. The real story was about decades of mismanagement, political priorities that put appearance over function, and a system that protected bureaucrats at the expense of the people they were supposed to serve. The state investigation report was released on a Tuesday morning. And by noon, it had destroyed 3 political careers and launched 2 federal investigations. Daniel stood in his rebuilt office, reading the executive summary, while news helicopters circled overhead. Systematic negligence in infrastructure maintenance, he read aloud to Sarah Kim, who had become an unlikely ally. Misappropriation of designated maintenance funds, deliberate suppression of engineering assessments that contradicted city policy. Kim nodded grimly. Walsh is facing criminal charges. The mayor resigned this morning, and the city council called an emergency session to approve your original flood mitigation plan. Too little, too late, Daniel said, looking out the window at the reconstruction efforts. 18 months ago, this would have cost $3 million. Now it's going to cost $40 million, and that's just for the immediate repairs. His phone buzzed with a call from Mrs. Patterson. She'd been staying with relatives while her house was being rebuilt, but she called Daniel every few days with updates on the neighborhood's recovery. Daniel, Dear, her voice was warm, despite everything she'd been through. I wanted you to know that the city approved full flood insurance coverage for everyone affected. They're also paying for temporary housing until repairs are complete. That's good news, Mrs. Patterson. It's more than good news. It's justice. Her voice grew stronger. And I wanted to thank you, not just for saving my life, but for fighting for the truth when everyone else was ready to make you the villain. After hanging up, Daniel walked outside to survey the work being done on the expanded flood barrier system. The new project was based on his original design, but scaled up to protect the entire watershed. It would take 2 years to complete, but when finished, it would prevent disasters like this one from ever happening again. Walsh approached him from across the construction site. She looked smaller, somehow older, worn down by the weight of public disgrace and impending legal consequences. I wanted to apologize, she said quietly. Daniel studied her face, looking for sincerity. For what, specifically? For not listening, for letting politics override engineering. For trying to destroy your reputation to save mine, she paused. For gambling with people's lives. What are you going to do now? Walsh shrugged. Cooperate. With the federal investigation, try to make amends where I can. Maybe learn something about admitting when I'm wrong. Daniel nodded. It's a start. As Walsh walked away, Daniel felt something he hadn't expected. Pity. She'd been a product of a system that rewarded short-term thinking and punished long-term planning. That didn't excuse her actions, but it explained them. The real victory wasn't her downfall, was the barrier being built behind him, the new flood-resistant community rising from the disaster, and the changes in city policy that would prevent future tragedies. 6 months later, Daniel stood before the city council in a packed meeting room, presenting the final phase of the flood mitigation project. But this time he wasn't fighting for approval, he was reporting on progress. The expanded barrier system is 60% complete, he announced, using a laser pointer to highlight progress on the projection screen. We're on schedule for full implementation by next spring, well ahead of the next flood season. The new mayor, elected on a platform of infrastructure accountability, nodded approvingly. And the cost, $38 million, which includes full neighborhood reconstruction and improved drainage throughout the watershed, still less than the economic impact of the original flood. Mrs. Patterson sat in the front row, her rebuilt house now one of the safest in the county. She'd become something of a local celebrity, frequently quoted in news articles about the importance of listening to residents' concerns about infrastructure after the meeting. Daniel walked through the neighborhood that had been underwater 6 months earlier. The new houses were built on raised foundations, with improved drainage and flood-resistant materials. The streets had been redesigned with bioswales and permeable pavement that could handle massive rainfall events. Sarah Kim met him at the site of the original barrier, which now formed the cornerstone of a much larger flood control system. Any regrets? She asked. Daniel considered the question. About building the barrier? No. About not doing it sooner? Yes. About fighting the system. When it tried to destroy me? Never. You know, you're something of a legend now, Kim said. Environmental engineering students are writing papers about you. The Chen protocol for flood mitigation is being adopted by cities across the region. Daniel smiled wryly. Fame is nice, but I'd rather have competent infrastructure. His phone buzzed with a text from another city, asking him to assess their flood risks. It was the 4th such request this week. The disaster had been terrible, but it had also proven the value of proactive engineering over reactive politics. As the sun set over the restored neighborhood, Daniel reflected on the journey from accusation to vindication. The truth had eventually emerged, but only after tremendous suffering that could have been prevented. The real lesson wasn't about his personal vindication. It was about the cost of ignoring inconvenient truths until they became unavoidable disasters. The barriers were stronger now, the drainage systems more robust, and the community more resilient. But most importantly, the people in charge were finally listening to the engineers instead of the politicians. Daniel's phone rang another city with aging infrastructure and a growing flood risk. He answered on the second ring. ready to help them avoid the mistakes that had cost this community so much. "Daniel Chen Engineering," he said. "How can I help you prevent a disaster?" The work continued, one barrier at a time, one community at a time, one truth at a time. And this time, people were listening.